Hello and welcome to our webinar on building sustainable stations. Thank you very much for dialing in. It's exactly 1 year to go until the world will be in Glasgow for the COP26 UN Climate Change Summit. So this is the first in a series of webinars we're running this week to mark that. We'll also be running a webinar on Wednesday about the green corridor we're creating, and on Thursday about how HS2 will decarbonise transport more broadly. We'll publish details of these and Eventbrite links in the event chat towards the end of this event. Now, we open all live events with some technical advice should you experience any connection issues. All lines are muted, so you don't have to worry about any background noise. If your feed freezes, wait for a few seconds as it will most likely correct itself. If this doesn't happen, use the leave button to exit the call and rejoin using the event link. You'll be able to use the toggle button at the bottom of your screen to rewind back to where you left. You can also pause at any point during the call should you need to. If you disconnect and you're unable to rejoin due to a wider Microsoft incident, we will email you with the next steps. There's a Q&A and comment function, which you should be able to find at the top right-hand side of your screen. Please feel free to submit your questions throughout the event, and we'll ask them to speakers towards the end. So that's all from me. Thank you very much again for joining. I'm now going to hand over to our first speaker, Matthew Patel, the Stations Director here at HS2 Limited.
Okay, thanks Hugo, and thanks for everybody for logging in. Hopefully this will be an informative session. I'm the Phase One Stations Director, so it's a great pleasure to be here today to talk about sustainable stations. And what I want to do with my first slide is set the context within which we're working. Obviously, it's to net zero emissions by 2050. And the graphic on the left of the screen just clearly demonstrates the key role we at HS2 have to play with hitting that target. As is obvious from the data shown, we're basically by far the most sustainable low carbon option on mass transit. So we literally are a no-brainer in terms of transport for the country. How does that translate on a company-wide? Because this is more than just about stations. On company-wide, we've got a number of corporate KPIs on carbon reduction, but most critically for me, that is actually cascaded directly into our contracts. For the main civil stations and rail contracts are required to achieve 50% carbon reduction as a minimum target, and also emission requirements captured by our environmental minimum requirements as part of the Act are cascaded into the works information. It's so important because that's what drives performance, behaviours on site, etc. So that sets the wider context. But if I move on to Phase One stations, what we've got is 4 stations. Each themselves would be huge projects. You've got Euston, terminus in London, Curzon, terminus in Birmingham, Old Oak Common, an interchange in West London, an interchange station in Solihull. All different stations, all with their nuances, but what you've got is commonality from a carbon perspective from all of them. We're trying to reduce directly, and that's methodology and contracts across the whole project lifecycle, across the whole business. Transport planning to maximise benefits for sustainable multimodal interface at each one of those locations, and then extrapolate that transport planning with land use interaction to extend those benefits, those carbon credentials, into the huge regenerations that we're going to drive around each of those locations. So if I look at each of those 3 key elements in series, we start with the direct carbon footprint impacts. As we talked about earlier, it's the design, construction and operation. Next slide, please. All of those elements are critical for reducing the carbon footprint. Central to that is our BREEAM approach for design, and my colleague and senior environmental manager Hannah Leggett will talk about that in the next section of this presentation. But suffice to say, in the contracts we have a target of excellent ratings for all stations, depots and buildings, which is absolutely critical, like I said earlier, to get that into the contracts. We've got a few massive wins that we've got around that. I've picked out a couple here. We could have a long list. Old Oak Common, 27% reduction in steel in the roof through advanced wind modelling. That equates to almost 3,000 tonnes of carbon reduced. Similarly, interchange, use of natural light to reduce LEDs, similar kind of output. So in the design, it's quite clear what we're going for. We're going for the best designs, frankly, that has ever been seen for stations. But then in actual construction, we're also focusing heavily on carbon reduction. So during the delivery, we've got lots of initiatives on site already, such as solar lighting or low emission transformers that we're using. But what I've picked out here, and again, we've got a whole host of innovative projects underway, is retrofitting to existing plant to try and make it equivalent to modern plant and thereby reduce the carbon in the whole life cycle. So direct carbon footprint is massive, and we are getting that more than 50% reduction across the piece. But then we move into transport planning. So transport planning extends those benefits, and what we've got at each station, Curzon Street as an example there, will interface and interact with the tram in Birmingham, which will be critical to get more users in, more users using sustainable transport, taking them off other modes. Similarly, at Old Oak Common, we've got an enormous interchange there. We've got interchange with the Elizabeth line Crossrail, Heathrow Express, and with the Great Western Main Line, which again draws people off of other modes onto more sustainable modes. More than that, though, what we've also done with each of the stations is encourage bicycle and foot movements, which leads us nicely into land use planning, the final thing I wanted to flag up in this overview. What we've got here is some graphics around Euston Station, which is most likely to be the largest of our oversight developments. And the graphic at the top of the slides demonstrates the increased permeability on sites where quite often the railway has bifurcated areas, so actually reduced footfall, reduced cycle routes. We will maximise this, setting that context around the station and setting a benchmark with key stakeholders to try and extend and encourage that development through the entire regeneration that surrounds these stations. Hopefully that's given you a bit of a flavour for an overview of how we're approaching stations. And now I'd like to hand over to my Senior Environmental Manager, Hannah Leggett, really to focus on some of those aspects.
Thank you ever so much, Matthew. So as Matthew mentioned, I'm going to be covering BREEAM. So the most important question I get asked is what exactly is BREEAM? So it stands for the Building Research Establishment Environmental Assessment Method. Quite a mouthful, but it effectively means it's the world's leading sustainability assessment method for infrastructure and buildings. It evaluates the specification, the design, the construction operation and the development and infrastructure of an asset against certain set targets that are based on performance benchmarks. This essentially means that BREEAM rated developments are more sustainable environments that actually enhance the well-being of the people who live and work in them. It also helps protect the natural resources that they're made from and the materials, and it also makes for a far more attractive property investment. So moving on, why does BREEAM matter to HS2? Well, we have selected BREEAM because it's a world recognised and third-party assured tool to demonstrate our sustainability credentials and our commitments to our stakeholders, but it's also to challenge our supply chain to raise the environmental benchmarks themselves and also to set new standards in sustainable development. So moving on, the BREEAM ratings. So HS2's target has set for BREEAM Excellent for all our stations and depots, which requires a weighted percentage score of at least 70%. This table gives an approximate benchmark of what an excellent rating actually means in terms of performance. And if we can see there, the benchmark is that all new buildings to achieve excellence should be in around the top 10% of new buildings in the UK. So HS2 is targeting that all their new depots and stations will achieve that top 10%. So what next? So what have our stations progress made so far? Well, Interchange Station has actually recently been awarded the BREEAM Outstanding certification at design stage, and is actually the first railway station in the world to actually achieve this, which, as we saw in that slide before, it actually puts it in the top 1% of all new buildings within the UK, which is a massive achievement. So how has this been achieved? Well, the station design actually includes things such as minimising demand for carbon through the use of natural ventilation and daylighting, as you can see from this artist's impression on the slide. It's energy efficient technology such as air source heat pumps and LED lighting. It's got over 2,000 square metres of solar panels, which will generate its own carbon electricity and remove the need for reliance on the grid. It also has rainwater harvesting on the roof, which will actually collect in the tanks and provide part of the building's water requirements, but also provide the irrigation for the surrounding planting within the station area. There is also 222 electric vehicle charging points, with further room for expansion in the future as the demand will dictate, and significant cycle storage. So this moves into that sustainable transport hub that we're looking at, and the catalysing the investment in other forms of low carbon transport. So moving on, Birmingham Curzon Street. So Curzon Street has been awarded an excellent rating with BREEAM, with ambitions to actually look at targeting outstanding at the construction stage. Through innovative design, there are actually 40 opportunities for carbon reduction, which result in a reduction in the station's lifetime emissions by over 87,000 tonnes of carbon equivalent. So just to put that in context, that's the same as removing the emissions of 10,000 houses, or the equivalent of travelling 500 million kilometres in your car. So it's a massive achievement. The station will also achieve net zero carbon emissions from energy consumed to operate the building integrated systems, using things like heating, cooling and lighting, things such as LED lighting, and generating low carbon energy through solar panels on the platform canopies and the installation of ground source heat pumps. Curzon Street as well, there will be extension to the Midlands Metro, as Matthew mentioned, space for over 500 bicycles, a low carbon sprint bus link, and also an easy interchange with Moore Street for those regional connections, which again links into that HS2 commitment to become sustainable, provides sustainable transport hubs, and catalysing that investment in other forms of low transport. So moving on to Old Oak Common. Similar to Curzon, this has achieved excellent, and we'll be looking at targeting outstanding at the next design stage. It's incorporated things such as specialist wind tunnel modelling, which has reduced the steel roof by over 27%, which is actually the equivalent to 2,700 tonnes of reduction in carbon. Other measures include rainwater harvesting, natural and low carbon ventilation, and natural landscaping. And Old Oak will also connect to Crossrail and the Great Western Rail services, making it one of the best connected places in the capital, and again links into that sustainable transport hub commitment that we've made as HS2. So hopefully that's given you a flavour of the project, demonstrated how HS2 stations will actually be some of the most environmentally friendly in the world, and also demonstrated some of our fantastic achievements to date. I'd now like to hand over to Richard Dilks, who's the CEO of COMOUK UK, who will talk about the concept of sustainable transport hubs in a more broader term.
Thank you, Hannah, and hi to everybody. Very good to be with you. Thank you to HS2 for having me along here. As Hannah says, I'm Chief Exec of COMOUK UK. That stands for Collaborative Mobility UK. We are a charity that's just turning 21 and dedicated, as you can see, to the public benefit of shared transport. So I've got bike, car and e-scooter schemes as examples there, but we're not defined by a particular mode. Actually, we're about bringing the modes together within shared transport, and then also thinking very much how to link with public transport, hence being here today, and with active travel, with walking and cycling. That's because all our research, which now goes back well over a decade in the car sharing space and over half a decade in the bike sharing space, consistently finds that people who use these shared transport schemes use public transport. In fact, they use public transport more than they did before they started using the shared transport scheme. We also find that they cycle more, and we find that they sell cars and drive cars less when they move from owned car to shared car. So in other words, lots of benefits, but also these are people who are reporting needing and using a spectrum of options. and shared is part of that for them, but it's very much alongside public transport and it's alongside walking and cycling. So those things to us, they all fit together. You can see a little bit more there about what we do. We are in many ways betwixt and between authorities of all kinds and operators. We're always driving after this public benefit point of shared transport. We work closely with local, regional, transport and national governments and authorities, and also with operators. Thank you, Hugo. Let's move on. So we've done this research, as I say, in the case of bike for over half a decade now and car for a decade. So the findings are very consistent. It'd be very interesting to find what we find this year. We've just got to the analysis stage on the bike work, and we just have the car work about to go out into field. COVID will undoubtedly affect this, but I don't think it will fundamentally break these linkages that we've observed over these many years. I think, if I might, just make a general point about car share, it suffers from having the word car in it. I think it's well understood that we need to restrain private car use to some degree in this country to hit the 2050 target that we started off hearing about at the top of this session. And shared cars, I think, get rather mixed up with that because after all, they're cars. They are, and we well understand that any sustainable transport hierarchy does not have a car of any form at the top of it. But I think there's a good argument for having shared cars in a different place in the hierarchy to owned ones. And I say that for the three reasons you can see on the screen there. One is this mileage point. So we consistently find that people drive fewer miles when they make the switch from owned to shared car. We're doing some research this year into why that might be, but I think it's partly at least because it makes people take a conscious decision that, yes, I do want to buy this journey in the shared car. I've got to book it. It's easy to do, but it's still a step to make that you're not making with a privately owned car. And as you're taking that step, it is saying to you, and this will cost you £7, £12, £15, whatever how much time you're buying. Again, your private car, of course, never says that. And the vast majority of the cost here is on the use with the shared car. It's not the sunk cost of the ownership, which might be £50 or £100 a year. Commonly with some large schemes now is nothing. Membership is free. Whereas, of course, your private car, it's the other way around. And so I think based on those changes, you see this reduction in mileage. And that, I think, is also part of this modal shift point that we find again and again and again. So that people are therefore using private cars less, but we're finding they're taking modal shift as well. So I think that says they haven't been pre-COVID anyway. They haven't been doing fewer journeys. They're just shifting some of those journeys. Now, that's a large part, I argue, of what we need to see generally in the UK with this restraining private car use piece. It's those journeys that can be done in other ways. How are we going to get people to shift? And car and bike share provides a real link with that. On the bike side, it does re-engage lap cyclists very powerfully. We find typically around 40–50% of new users of a scheme in any 1 year haven't cycled for a significant period. So I think that's a different reach to all the messaging and effort around private cycling, and it's not to undermine that at all. Not least because about half of the scheme's users have their own bike as well. So the world doesn't neatly divide down into people who are only using shared or only using their own things. So then I think as we move on, what I'm really here to talk to you about today, and looking forward to the Q&A on this too very much, is ways of bringing this stuff together. I hope I'm laying out the case here about how people use this stuff together in their own lives anyway. But I think we've got a way here of forcing the rhubarb, if you like, and we can borrow from comparator countries in Northern Europe and in the US in particular, where they've been designing what we call for shorthand mobility hubs. You can, I think, sometimes think of them as community hubs as well. For a good while, City of Bremen, for example, has had a dedicated program on this since 2003. These things, in our definition anyway, are bringing together shared mode or modes, public transport mode or modes, walking and cycling, with some sort of public realm also. They can be very modest in scale. They can be very much in the back streets with just a very few ingredients there. And that's how a lot of the early networks have got going, and they've built up from that. they can be much larger. HS2 strikes me as an absolutely prime project to borrow a leaf out of this book and think about how it can make the journeys to and from itself, where people then carry on the high-speed train, more sustainable. I think also there's a community place-based role here. This isn't necessarily all about people who are going to get on those HS2 trains. You know, these will be enormous stations, as we were seeing. They'll have huge catchment areas, but they're also very important local impacts as well. So I think there's an interesting role here for things that local communities might well be needing and using, who are, yes, using the HS2 station, but not necessarily using HS2. Shall we? Yes, thank you. So here's an example, and you can see the sorts of ingredients we've got here, a relatively all singing, all dancing one with some public transport information points, the all-important coffee, cargo bike EV charging for shared EVs, of course, e-scooters, e-bikes, pick-up and drop-off locker. I think it's just worth dwelling on the logistics point for a second. These pick-up and drop-off locker points are well established in lots of the European ones, and that seems a relative no-brainer, I think. There may be, in some instances, a sort of game of two halves hub where one side is quite B2B focused, and could this be the micro or macro logistics consolidation hub to reduce the diesel van in particular burden on local roads, within a B2C, a consumer-facing bit that feeds off that. Moving on, if you would, thank you. So a few examples just to go through. This is the sort of relatively humble back streets type approach I was talking about. You can see we've got a bus stop there. We've got some private bike parking. Though a couple of those bays are locked out for shared car use. We've got a totem pole and an information board, which is on the other side of the ad on the bus stop. And that's it. So, you know, these things don't have to be huge risks or white elephants or majorly expensive. In moving up the scale, though, if we can move on, this is one in central Vienna. We can see down bottom right, those are the pickup drop-off lockers, a fleet of shared e-cargo bikes there. There are also shared EVs out of shot, and very obviously we're at a tram stop, so we're getting to you know, more significant investment and a bigger place and bigger levels of interchange. Yes, thank you. Moving on. Another example, this is in Hamburg, and it's actually further out in Hamburg. So it's an example of using, not getting too confused around the status of car. This is using shared cars quite largely. You can see the ones with the logos as ways of funneling in to a public transport network. Something that actually we don't do so much in the UK, but I think would be hugely important for HS2. Thank you. And a different variant, again, you can see this is quite coach-based. So this is a sort of motorway service station type equivalent location in the Netherlands with very significant bike parking and then coach pickup and drop-off points. So we have published, you can see the link there, and these slides I think will come around to people afterwards. The link is on our website. Published an introductory guide, and it has these 6 different types of location. With HS2, we'd be talking about the large interchange city type hubs type. But to make the point again that this is a flexible concept, and we have a network that meets every 3 months with people trying to take these forwards up and down the country, and we're seeing ones of all different types come forwards. I think it's not long at all before we will get the first ones come out of the pipeline and come into reality. Just a few months, I think. Thank you. So I think all I've been saying holds true after COVID. I would say that, wouldn't I? But it does undoubtedly, the radical change we've seen in movement patterns this year, it does have, I think, an impact on our thinking and practice in this area, particularly around the commute. I think some of those journeys will just not come back. That's as far as my crystal ball is working anyway. And we're seeing an intensified appetite from authorities, investors, other parties who are trying to pivot around this and thinking, well, if more people are going to be staying in one place for longer, what does that mean about the community side of things? I think in HS2 context, for me anyway, at this stage, that just makes it more interesting about the local community aspect of these areas. Can these be places where people want to come to work to meet, but they're not traveling to work in what may be seen as the old-fashioned sense? Thanks. So a bit more detail on what we've been up to. We've published this introductory guide. We now have an accreditation standard, which we are launching at our conference, which is this week, in fact. I've not got full details on it here. This is an example table. Essentially, you can get bronze, silver or gold accreditation standards, a little bit of a flavour of BREEAM that we were hearing about before here. And there are various ingredients that you need to have across various categories to attain that. We've deliberately structured it so that it's not just the huge places and the huge hubs that would automatically get gold. It's not impossible to be small scale rural and get gold, for example, but that there are some key ingredients here that any hub to get accreditation must clear. And then there is a hierarchy of the amount and the quality of provision. Thank you. A moment to mention the planning system. So I'm well aware that these things I've been merrily talking about, hubs, they don't have a definition in our planning system, planning law at the moment. We are engaging with MHCLG around the white paper process, along with many others who are also propounders of this hubs approach, to seek to change that in time. And I think that that change will be needed. A broader point here also, I've put slightly cheekily 5, the mentions of transport in the planning white paper. So it is something of an uphill battle, I think, at the moment, in terms of the planning system for actually pushing these things through. That said, I think there's huge appetite and interest. So I think in a nutshell, we'll get there, but there is somewhere further to get. It's an interesting one. It's where I think the transport debate is ahead of the spatial planning one. We just need to integrate the two much better. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is moving towards the end. You'll be relieved to know, and some thoughts on what we might be wanting to work with HS2 on, some seeds to hopefully sow. The conceptual level of all of this, as I've just been covering, thinking about accreditation, quality standards of this, and I think also research on what these things could be. And then skipping forwards in time, once they're built, how people are using them or not using them, or what are they getting out of it. I think it's important for us to learn fast in this space. The world's moving fast. The shared transport sector certainly moves fast, and I think we should too. Ultimately, I think there's an interesting opportunity here about the first last mile connectivity and the community place of HS2. Thank you. That brings me to an end. So my details are up on the screen. Be delighted if you want to be in touch, and let me now hand on to Paul Faulkner, who is Chief Executive of Birmingham Chambers of Commerce. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, and good afternoon, everybody. In true 2020 style, I spent the first 20 minutes having some IT problems. I'm afraid I missed Hannah's presentation, so I do hope that I won't replicate too much. But you know, I think really a lot of what I will say will probably support what you were sort of talking us through there, Richard, and that way that the HS2 can really help to force a rhubarb. It's a great phrase, and one that hopefully I'll cover off. So I'm just going to rattle through a few slides, and I'm mindful of the time as well. I know we want to get to questions. Just a little bit of context about the Greater Birmingham Chambers of Commerce. This is our sort of group structure, and also maybe draw out that obviously we represent the chambers in Birmingham and also Solihull, so the two local authority areas where the sort of first two HS2 stations outside of London will be located at Interchange and Curzon. But we also have chambers in places like such as Lichfield and Tamworth, where we know HS2 has been a little bit more contentious over the period. The next slide just gives a very high level overview of a chamber, like all chambers of commerce across the country, all 53 accredited. Now we're sort of fully immersed in the local business community and really cut through a complete slice of that business community. So sort of we have members representing all sectors, all shapes and sizes of business, and then have, you know, I guess a good finger on the pulse for what they're feeling and thinking. And certainly HS2 has been a project which here in the West Midlands, in sort of Birmingham and the wider outside of certain little pockets, I think has been long welcomed. There's a stat that we were surveying before my time back in 2006, when over 70% of local businesses were in favour of HS2. And I'd say that now it's far greater, and it's just woven into our story around regeneration here completely. And just the next slide just gives a little indication that while of some of our larger member businesses, quite often people think chambers work with SMEs only. Not correct. We do have partner up with HS2, also with LM, the Lang O'Rourke Murphy JV have been doing the enabling works, and also the likes of Arup and WSP, who of course been behind the designs of the first of these two stations up here in the West Midlands. And the next slide just gives a little indication of some of the policy and insight and intelligence work that we're doing up here. So again, the information that we're able to gather about the impact of HS2 on our regional economy and how it feeds in with other elements is pretty significant. Also, we do a lot here around I guess congestion in the region, and are working hand in glove with Birmingham City Council on the rollout of their clean air zone, which is going to take effect in Birmingham City Centre in June 2021. So transport, and certainly sort of moves towards sustainable transport solutions, which have a positive effect on the whole economy, a big part of what we do here. A little bit of context again for the audience who maybe aren't too aware of Birmingham. We're the second city, but second to nobody, as we like to say, just to give you a little sense of the scale of the regional economy, number of organisations based here, and you can see not just local or the city of 1,000 trades anymore, but a big international reach as well. Also a real hub for startup businesses, and outside of London over the past 5 or 6 years have been leading the way in that. So it's a very sort of, or has been a very dynamic, vibrant economy here. And I would say that probably, you know, the last decade has really seen a renaissance of the city centre, which has then started to cascade out. And at the very heart of that has been almost the promise of HS2 itself, but the promise of that, and then that's starting to sort of move now into a more tangible phase, certainly with the stations, and sort of really starting to take shape, not just aesthetically sort of, but, you know, the sort of the impetus that has given to investment in and around the city. You can see obviously the moment with COVID, like everywhere, things have taken a bit of a stall, but if we move to the next slide, you'll just see 3 of the sort of key pillars that we talk about up here, again, just to give a bit of regional context, which have always been important, but are going to be even more important now as we enter the sort of recovery phase from COVID, and maybe sort of 3 set pieces that should give this region, or we feel, a slightly disproportionate positive way of getting out of this. We've got the Coventry City of Culture activity running for a year from next spring through to May 2022, which we saw in Hull 4 or 5 years ago, was a massive springboard there. That will feed nicely into the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham in the summer of 2022, which again is a that sort of one-off event which will add a huge amount of economic benefit to the region, and also stimulate regeneration, which without it wouldn't be happening. But all of that really fits in with HS2, as I say, probably for the last 10 years plus. That's been the single biggest driver of the renaissance that we've seen here, and its importance just increases even more. And you get a sense there just of the sort of the scale. The headquarters are here in Birmingham in Snow Hill, so we're sort of directly employing nearly 1,500 people, but very sort of conservatively, we estimate it's going to create well over 100,000 jobs in the West Midlands area just in the next decade, let alone what lies beyond that once we get into phases, or phase 2 to A and 2B. In terms of our relationship with HS2, so it goes back a long time, and we've been doing a lot of advocacy around that. I think it's fair to say that from a sustainability point of view, it's felt to us that HS2 has always been ahead of the curve of that, really. I think very early on it recognised the interplay between sustainability and economic benefits, and how, you know, sort of really building on those, it helps to drive further investment. And we know that people want to invest in clean projects. We know that people want to live and work where air pollution is low. That's why one of the reasons why the clean air zone is coming in. And, you know, when we were, say, 12 months ago, we were looking at our plans for 2020, and we really thought that sustainability was going to be top of the agenda alongside Brexit. Obviously, COVID's come and slightly taken the limelight, but I think that there's no doubt that's where the future is heading, and HS2 fits very, very nicely in there. You'll see that the photo on the top right is just one. The gentleman second from left is Douglas Oakervee, who obviously led the Oakervee review, and that was probably one of the most important bits of lobbying we were able to do in the past 12 months with HS2. And we're actually standing there on the balcony of Birmingham City University, overlooking the Curzon Street station sign. And I think, you know, stressing the environmental benefits of HS2 to Douglas Oakervee and his group was massively important. I don't think that was necessarily really well understood. And so that this was back in, I think it was October, November last year, and we really went to town stressing that this isn't just good for the economy, but it's good for the environment as well, for lots and lots of different reasons I'm sure we'll touch on in the Q&A. And I think that certainly over the past 12 months, we've seen the sort of comms in general start to build on that, and we can really emphasize how and why this is a positive for the whole country. I mean, that inextricable link between the development here and also sustainability goes without saying. You know, HS2 is a massive catalyst for change. This is the interchange station out in Solihull. It's going to be sort of, as we say there, the best connected place in the UK. If we flick to the next slide, you'll get a better sense of the location there. I'm sure many people would have driven up the M42 and you'd have gone past Birmingham Airport and the NEC, and you can see the blue triangle just on the right is where this is going to be. And really it's that stimulus for driving new jobs. We're not just building a station, but the Arden Cross site that's been developed by the Urban Growth Company up here is going to be adding about 70,000 jobs just around this area. It's going to allow us to build new homes, 5,000 homes, which are much needed extra commercial space. And you can see the GVA uplift there, over 6 billion per annum, which, just to give some context, is greater than the GVA of Southampton at present. So, you know, without HS2 coming, that simply wouldn't be the case. But the key is that it's not just a station where you can kind of get off and get over to the airport, but it's being done in a way which is sort of really acted as that catalyst for additional investment. The story is very much the same at Curzon Street Station in the middle of Birmingham as well, which we can see here. It's the old terminus building, which will form part of the new site. And I suppose the main difference here to what's happening over in Solihull is just that it's happening in an urban environment. And, you know, for those of you taking the train into Birmingham at any time in the past 20 or 30 years, you'd know that you normally pull in to New Street and you sort of halt outside, and there's a big piece of sort of derelict land. In the background you'll get Millennium Point, and in recent years some new university buildings going up. But that's sort of fundamentally the site where the new Curzon Street Station is going, and you know, it's just going to totally transform. Well, it's the next stage of transformation here for Birmingham city centre, and will help to connect parts of the city such as Digbeth, which has become a sort of creative hub in recent years, but it will plug that in to the rest of the city, provide so much more connectivity. And well, as we were sort of on the previous stage, will act as that catalyst for the modal change around transport. We're getting metro running into the station, some of our Sprint rapid bus services as well, also a big catalyst for some of the cycling plans that we've got going on, and fits absolutely fundamentally into Birmingham City Council's new transport plans, which are pretty innovative and far-reaching, actually, and again linking with what they're doing around the clean air zone. And here again you just see some of the stats on the economic impact of Curzon. Massive amount of additional private sector investment, more jobs being added in, and another big GVA uplift. But fundamentally it will help to just reimagine the city and add to that sense of renaissance, and Birmingham shaking off the image that it has, sadly, which is still sort of too true around the country, and really sort of position it as a place which is going places and a place to come and live and work as well. So yeah, very exciting from a Birmingham and a wider West Midlands point of view, and hopefully I know it's set at pace, but hopefully it just adds to the conversation today. So with that, I think I'm going to hand back to Hugo now to handle the Q&A session.
Perfect. Thank you very much indeed, Paul. And thank you everybody for submitting all of your questions. There's quite a few of them, so unfortunately we won't be able to get through all of them, but we'll try our best to get through as many as we can in the 15 minutes we have remaining. So the first question I'm going to ask to Matthew Patel, and after I ask Matthew, Paul, I might also get your take on this from a Birmingham perspective. But the question is, will there be a concerted effort to encourage and enable people to walk and cycle to HS2 stations? For example, are there adequate public transport links that connect neighbourhoods, behaviour change campaigns that encourage active travel? So Matthew, if you're able to address that from an HS2 perspective, then afterwards, Paul, if you've got anything you want to say from the West Midlands perspective, I'd like to hear that as well.
Okay, thanks, Hugo. I think this touches on the second and third points I made in my presentation. The one being transport planning, where it's absolutely essential we get multimodal hubs, and as well as multimodal, that we make them accessible for pedestrians and cyclists as well. And that's linked to the land use planning, and Paul touched on that quite a lot as well, which is we're working closely with all the main planning and developers around each of our stations. They're all the same kind of approaches as I described and Paul talked about in the West Midlands. We're doing the same things in London as well. We work with the local authorities, local planning authorities to absolutely maximise benefits, which in the case of London stations tend to be via the GLA. So we've got dedicated numbers of cycling positions, cycling provision, etc. But we have exactly the same in the West Midlands. But I really can't overemphasize the transport land use planning interaction. It's like that master plan I showed for Euston. You've got to get permeability through the sites, and it's permeability that really engages footfall, and by extension then cycling as well. So I would say it's a resounding yes.
And I'd simply just back that up. Absolutely. And I mean, the point I made, if you know Birmingham, then this will connect Digbeth with sort of the east side part of the city. And at the moment, you just can't get from one to the other. So that permeability comes in spades with the Curzon Street station. And, you know, it actually sort of underpinning all of the broader planning efforts that are taking place here in the region. And I think, you know, that's just that sense of being embedded really with the future plans.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, guys. Our next question goes to Hannah Leggett by the looks of it. And the question is, was there any consideration for using more carbon friendly material such as wood or live rooftop gardens instead of primarily steel?
Yes, so the design has gone through a load of reiterations. So Arup, who are the station designers, have actually gone through a value engineering process. So some of the things that came out of this was the massing of the station building itself, and the structures were greatly reduced. It was changed from 2 levels to a single level podium. The structural requirements to be incorporated have been reduced as well. The main station was actually changed to a modular design, which actually reduces the materials overall and means that the station can actually be altered, extended or rejuvenated as it goes through its 120-year lifespan. And the material choices for the roof elements actually resulted in glulam beams being chosen as one of the main structural elements. So this actually reduced or eliminated the need for significant parts of the steel frame. And it's also been designed to keep in context of its surroundings. So it's also now incorporated sunken rain gardens in the public plaza area, and there will also be an outdoor terrace to the station concourse. And as mentioned in previous slides, it's gone through a load of design choices that has actually allowed it to achieve that BREEAM outstanding. So it has actually been through an enormous process to make sure that it is fully environmentally friendly to actually achieve that BREEAM outstanding credential.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed, Hannah. We've got a question here, which I think, Richard, it's better addressed to you. Are there any great examples of sustainable transport hubs in the UK which HS2 can use to model their designs and build on?
Yes and no, man. So in terms of the kind of hubs I was talking about, no, I don't think we have anything in the UK yet. But as I was saying, we are close. I think we will shortly get something in London. There are some in Scotland that are nearly ready, have been announced. There are, of course, the Transforming Cities Fund winners, a couple of which have mobility hubs planned. All the future transport zones have mobility hubs in them to some degree, and the Nottingham Derby one is heavily focused around mobility hubs. Midlands Connect are just coming towards the end of a piece of work we've been involved with about strategising where hubs might go across their largely their rural areas, stretching from Welsh border over to the coast. So I think we will get there. I think we do have, though, a good roster of examples of good public transport integration, integrating different public transport modes with each other. So there's certainly that to build. I think also in this country, we've got something where, dare I say it, we might do a bit better than some other European nations. I think, don't know how they struck you, but some of my pictures, those places, they look functional, they're interesting conceptually, they're driving behaviour change on the ground. But I wouldn't say they necessarily look like wonderful places to hang out quite necessarily. I think we in this country have got a real talent and skill base for this, and that's really grown in the last 10, 15 years. So, making these really nice places you actually want to go to is, I'm sure, part of the success here. So I like to think we could give us 5 years, and then we could be thinking about having a good number of these. There's then a question which I didn't get into because it's early days, but about how to think about networking these things together, which might then get very interesting in a bit way of, in HS2's case, thinking about how it links to a wider ecosystem across those areas. That's part of enabling people to travel sustainably, not just when they're on an HS2 train.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Richard. We have a question here which is addressed specifically to Matthew, so I'm just going to read that out. It says that transport and land use planning is optimizing the operational/user carbon once the station is present. Is there also an ambition to enable the net zero carbon transition for the region and neighbourhood the stations belong to?
What I would say to that is that's in development with stakeholders. So each stakeholder that we deal with has bespoke aspirations, but pretty much they're all, for all 4 stations, in alignment with the UK target. Nobody's shooting low. I mean, I think Paul really brought that out earlier with his discussion around the West Midlands, and I can say it's no different in London. With the 2 developments that we've got around Old Oak Common and around Euston, everyone is seeking to build with the same targets in mind. So the developments are all very carbon low in their aspirations and all very mobility focused, and particularly in terms of, like I say, cycles and footfall, and just maximising the amount of local regeneration. So I can't say all the answers there now because of the timescales we're talking about, but we're working with people like Paul and the key stakeholders he talked about in the West Midlands, UGC, Ardent Cross, etc. All the interested bodies that are involved at each of these locations to try and get the best output. And a lot of that is making sure our station speaks to and amplifies the master plan. So it's very much an iterative cycle of working with key stakeholders and working into and building onto their master plans. And I think to date we've done that very effectively. But are we at the final stage? No. But it's in development and it's going in the right direction, and we are all focusing on the same carbon target.
Great, thanks, Matthew. I should say as well, we're getting a lot of questions about whether this event will be recorded and shared afterwards. We will be publishing it on our YouTube channel, so do look out for that, just in case you missed any parts of it. Our next question goes to Hannah Leggett, and that is, what do Curzon Street Station in Birmingham and Old Oak Common in London have to do to achieve an outstanding BREEAM rating?
So we have actually done some preemptive exercises with our designers. So there are some interim design reports on what potentially we could do to achieve outstanding. So the biggest piece will be actually looking at that during the next phase, which is construction. So working with our construction partners and actually getting them to understand where we want to get to in relation to outstanding and how we can achieve that, but also looking at what credits have already been banked in relation to BREEAM Excellent and the delta between the excellent percentage and the outstanding percentage. So that's something that we are really going to look at the next stage and make sure that our contractors are on board, but also understand how they can achieve that. And myself and my colleagues within the technical directorate will be looking to take that forward in spring next year.
Thank you very much, Hannah. So I think we've got off time for one last question here, and that is to Paul. Paul, the question is, do you think these transport improvements in Birmingham would have happened without the HS2 stations coming to the city?
Yeah, thanks, Hugo. I mean, I think it's fair to say there would have been an aspiration for this sort of shift and direction of travel. But in my mind, that there's no doubt that it wouldn't be happening, or the plans wouldn't be in place for it to happen at the pace that it is without HS2. It's such a catalyst. It's such an enabler. There's the scale of transformation that it's bringing about in the city here is phenomenal, and I think that that's allowed people to be ambitious and to think big and to reimagine spaces and what we can do. And you can see why, because actually, this is happening and is going to be developed over the coming years. I mentioned that giant site right in the middle of the city, which is going to move from being an eyesore to something which sits right at the heart of Birmingham. And I think that it's only HS2 which has allowed that. When we talk about Oakervie and the sort of the review that took place at the end of last year, before we got the notice to proceed on HS2, I think that's one of the biggest worries about that. If the project didn't happen, everything would sort of come to a halt and there'd be so many knock-on implications. So you really can't underestimate what an absolutely essential enabler this is, and it's one that we've been living with here and building into our plans now for years. So it's almost, it's not new. It's just HS2 and the sort of what that's allowing, what else it's allowing to happen is just woven into our thinking. And so it's almost, I'd say, unimaginable that it wouldn't happen, because how else would we have to go right back to the drawing board to try to make so many other plans. So hopefully that gives a sense of just how important it is, not just for the stations and for the connectivity, but for enabling so many other aims and aspirations that we've got.
Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed, Paul. And I think that's all we've got time for today. Just want to say thank you to all our speakers for taking the time to talk to everyone today, and for all the attendees who have dialed in. We really appreciate it. Like I said, we have 2 more webinars we're running this week to mark 1 year to go until the COP26 Climate Change Summit, one on the Green Corridor on Wednesday, and one on how HS2 is decarbonising the transport network more broadly on Thursday. I will email those links round to all attendees in case you're interested, and a copy of the slides will be sent round as well. And as I mentioned earlier, you can find a recording of this event on our YouTube channel later in the week. But all that's left for me to say is thank you very much for dialing in, and enjoy the rest of your Monday. Thank you.